531 PI.
It is 8:31. Welcome back to Pacific Mornings on 531 PI. Wednesday, the 12th of November. William Terite in the driver's seat with you through until 9 a.m. Now, today marks Remembrance Day for survivors of abuse in state care. A moment of reflection, truth-telling and ongoing calls for justice. Joining me to kōrero about that is our Human Rights Commissioner, Julia Whaipooti. A very good morning to you. Kia ora.
Morena, kia ora.
Look, this is a National Day of Reflection, of course. What does that mean to you?
Tuatahi, for me, as a mama, as a tangata from Aotearoa and from Te Moananoia Kiwa, it is a day to acknowledge our whānau, our people, morehu survivors, who have experiences they never should have had. It is a day for all of us in Aotearoa and across the Pacific to acknowledge the state's and faith-based institutions' role in the abuse of our people and the harm that has and continues to cause. It is a time for us to be reminded that we must never forget about this, and actually that it is time to hold the government to account in acting. I want to talk to all of our whānau and survivors to say that you are believed, you are loved, you are always loved, and the failures of the state and the abusers to manage that is something that we carry today and every day.
And look, Pacific families often trusted state and faith-based institutions to care for their children, and many survivors have shared experiences of isolation and racism while in care. I suppose that begs the question, how important is it to recognise the cultural and historical context of that harm, especially for our Māori and Pacific survivors?
That's incredibly important. One of the findings from the Royal Commission is acknowledging actually the cultural abuse that has occurred in that the state, individuals within those systems and structures and within church institutions, the targeting of those different cultural contexts and beliefs that enabled abuse. By design, that enabled abuse. That means that it's actually quite central in terms of our identity. Abuse is also on your identity in terms of stories of children, Samoan children of the Pacific who reported into the Commission, who talk about going in and having to fill out a form about what ethnicity are you, and Samoan wasn't there and Pacific wasn't there, and they were ticked other. That was a form of abuse and deleting your identity, compounded with a number of other factors and other areas of abuse. So culturally, it is central. You cannot address the healing of abuse, any healing process, without acknowledging someone in their entirety and the location of which we come from and the settings that enabled it, which were not settings of our cultures. That's quite central, yes.
And look, the Commission, important to point out, has expressed concern that some survivors could be excluded from redress based on past offending. How does that align or, say, conflict with a human rights approach?
Wholly inappropriate. Human rights don't stop at the door. Don't stop at the door of prisons. They don't stop at the door of mental health institutions. They don't stop at the door of humanity. So it's something we wholly disagree with from a human rights perspective, but actually also that the ultimate offender and abuser in this process is the state, and it is the state administering who gets redress, who is entitled to that. It shouldn't be left to the abuser to identify who is a worthy survivor. So to be really clear, the umbilical cord of abuse, we know that the majority of whānau who ended up in gangs, which is a large proportion of Māori and Pacific people within gang whānau, the gangs were creations inherently created by state abuse and violence and neglect of our children and young people and how they were managed and treated. So the state does not get to continue its abuse by deciding who are the people that they've abused are worthy of being acknowledged and recognised for that.
Yeah, certainly. And what would a truly independent, culturally grounded redress system look like for Pacific survivors and their whānau then? And how can we, I suppose, ensure that political change or delays in Parliament, which is kind of inevitable sometimes, doesn't stall justice for survivors?
It's a really important question, and that should sit within ainga and whānau and community of Pacific and Māori. I think, as Te Moananoia Kiwa, we are connected. It needs to be led by that, acknowledging that the Royal Commission, in terms of the survivors that came forward, less than 5% were Pacific whānau that reported into that process. And that's wholly understandable, given it was not a process that there's whakamā shame attached to that. But what was loud and clear is that it needs to be independent. It needs to be led by survivors, what they have spoken. And when we're talking about Pacifica Māori, and it is not all just one flavour, but that survivors get to describe what it is that they need and want, and that the state ultimately, one of the main recommendations is an independent redress system, which means it shouldn't be sitting in the hands of the state, and that their role should be giving over the millions of dollars that they are spending every year to actually locate it where it belongs.
And, beyond, say, the apologies and the redress, I mean, what other meaningful action would you perhaps like to see?
Meaningful action's really clear. The Royal Commission had over 200 recommendations, and you don't get to cherry pick which ones work to stop the harm that is occurring. And to be really clear, so the Royal Commission was focused on a time period of 1950 to 99, so it's named historical abuse, but what we know is that the settings still exist today that can enable abuse to continue to occur. So the focus of where to from here really needs to acknowledge that abuse is still occurring. We need to make changes and resources that go into the hands of survivors and make sure we are listening to them.
Yeah. And, I suppose, and this is in some ways you've answered this, but let's dive a wee bit deeper in terms of what lessons should Aotearoa take from this, not just to prevent abuse, but to create systems that uphold mana, dignity for all, including, of course, Pacific and Māori children.
Well, just to add to that, the point that I was making before, in terms of there were over 200 recommendations, lots of those were targeted at in terms of what needs to work for Māori and Pacific survivors and whānau now and from the past. And the state response isn't just picking a few of those recommendations, because what that commits to is enabling abuse to continue and inaction to it becomes hollow words. So we're a year on from the government announcing their apology or saying that they were sorry, which was received with hope. However, when they have implemented and committed to less than 10% of the recommendations on the whole, then what you're doing is committing to not listening to the survivors, still enabling systems and structures that abuse can continue to occur. So there is... Today, if we're wanting this for Māori and Pacific peoples, not just the survivors, because the harm caused to, we know any mokopuna or child or individual harms all of us. It harms our whakapapa, it harms generations, it harms our whānau and in our communities. Is that for us, it's not relying just on the state's response, because what they've done so far is shown that they're not meeting the Commission's recommendations and what survivors have told them already. So for us is what can we do within our own communities, our own hapu, within our own ainga, within our own whānau, to make spaces to make sure we are preventing abuse from occurring, and also how are we holding government and the church institutions to account for the harm that they have done. And it's been set out, a pathway's been set out in the Royal Commission recommendations. And so there's something to keep for those of us. So for us as the Human Rights Commission, we have a role to continue to push these to the Crown to say, hey, these are the grossest human rights abuses in this country has ever seen. Yeah. You must act now. And it's not a 3-year term. It's cross-party government, political parties, te mea.
Yeah, certainly. And just picking up on that point, though, I mean, do you feel like there's been genuine sense of collaboration and wanting to do right, specifically given it happened during the apology happened during this coalition's time in government? Has there been, do you think, meaningful response and action from, say, the coalition?
I think that across parties, people can genuinely understand that abuse of children is not okay.
Yes.
And so on a surface level, there's this commitment individually across all parties. However, the actions that have followed do not reflect that commitment, and we need deep and meaningful commitment. We need to depoliticise this. I know when the Royal Commission final report was tabled in Parliament, they would also at the same time passing a bill in Parliament to open up a new boot camp, which was one of the functions and one of the settings that abuse occurred that was found in the Royal Commission. So the actions haven't followed, but what I think is really important is that every government over decades has failed. They have contributed to and enabled abuse to occur. And so what needs to happen now is that we need to depoliticize this. It can't be a tit for tat, who is a worthy survivor at this moment. At the moment, this government looking at passing a bill that says if you're a survivor that has gone on and done any form of criminal offending or something like that, then you're not worthy of monetary redress from the state. They don't get to do that. So actions, no, haven't followed, and that's something that we are calling on, is that we need more than just words. At the moment, they're falling hollow. If there isn't a meaningful commitment to implement what the Commission has set out, what thousands of survivors have set out in their own experiences to contribute to that, and less than 10% of the recommendations being implemented or committed to, shows that commitment isn't there yet.
Yeah, certainly. Final question for you, for Pacific families listening this morning who may still carry pain or silence from that era or even now, I mean, what would you want them to hear today?
That is something that we, in terms of how we know as a peoples, and I speak as a Māori woman, but as a taina to the Pacific, our whanaunga in the Pacific, that we know that ignoring hara and pain doesn't disappear it, that it exists, and we have ways of dealing with that in a way that can bring it to the light and bring whatever repair and utu and healing is required. That the shame, it sits where the abuse came from. It doesn't sit within our whānau or the children that were abused. Many of the survivors who spoke to you directly, and those who didn't speak, and those who didn't survive, to you directly, the shame and the embarrassment and the responsibility is never yours. And for us to see it that way, when we can see the children, I had the privilege of sitting in with our whānau in over hundreds of hours. And my previous role was at the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care, working with our whānau, and the recounting of the earliest memories of the abuse that had occurred, and the conditions that allowed that to happen, where it made it not a safe place to go speak to their whānau. That actually, some of the hardest things is we don't talk about it, but we do need to talk about it because it doesn't disappear it, and then that's the way we can lift harm and shame within that. So it's mamai as it should be. This is a hurting wound that seeps into generations for us as peoples, and turning away from that anymore isn't something is an option, but that to go into it with love, the love for our mokopuna, and the love with our ancestors behind us, and knowing that individuals that have caused harm within our whānau, because a lot of abuse comes from where we know, with people that we know, that the whānau, we have to respond to that. So nui te aroha. It is not easy. Yes.
Human Rights Commissioner Julia Whaipooti, thank you very much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Ka kite.